Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr., two names whispered in fear across Glasgow's underworld, vanished from a high-security prison that was never meant to hold them, exposing a web of corruption so deep it turned Scotland's justice system into a criminal empire's safest hiding place. It began on a cold February morning in Glasgow, when a convoy of unmarked police vehicles rolled quietly through the city's industrial outskirts. For months, law enforcement had been watching the movements of two men who had long eluded justice. Ross Monaghan, name that carried weight in every corner of Scotland's criminal underworld, and Eddie Lyons Jr., a younger but equally dangerous man believed to be one of the country's most efficient contract killers. Their arrests would later be described as one of the most strategic operations in recent Scottish history, but what happened afterward would raise far more questions than it answered. Ross Monaghan had been under suspicion for years, connected to multiple gangland shootings, arms trafficking and money laundering operations that spread beyond Scotland. Yet, every time he was brought to court, witnesses vanished, evidence crumbled, and charges quietly disappeared. Eddie Lyons Jr., on the other hand, represented the new generation of Glasgow's underworld, a ruthless hitman with no moral code, rumored to have carried out assassinations for rival factions while keeping his own identity in the shadows. For police, bringing these two men into custody at the same time was not just a victory, it was an opportunity to dismantle decades of organized violence that had plagued the region. The operation had been carefully planned. Surveillance teams had tracked their every movement for months, following encrypted messages, burner phones, and secret meetings across the city. The breakthrough came when investigators intercepted a conversation suggesting a planned retaliation attack against a rival gang. That intelligence allowed the authorities to move in swiftly. At dawn, heavily armed officers from the National Crime Agency and Police Scotland's Organised Crime Division surrounded a high-walled property in Renfrewshire, where Monaghan and Lyons were believed to be meeting. Within minutes, the estate was stormed. Neighbors reported hearing flashbangs and shouting, followed by a long silence. When the dust settled, both men were in custody. Weapons, cash, and false documents were seized, including a list of names police believed were targets in upcoming attacks. It was the breakthrough detectives had waited years for. But what happened after the arrests stunned even the most experienced officers. Instead of being sent to a traditional high-security facility like Barlinnie or Shotts, Monaghan and Lyons were transported to a newly built section of an undisclosed prison in central Scotland. Officially, it was described as a secure isolation unit for high-risk inmates, yet, even from the start, something about the transfer seemed unusual. The convoy that carried them was escorted not only by police, but also by unmarked vehicles driven by private contractors. The route was kept secret, and their location was withheld from public records. For ordinary citizens, the news of the arrests sparked cautious optimism that Glasgow's reign of gang violence might finally be over. Newspapers hailed the operation as a decisive blow to the criminal networks controlling the city's drug trade. But within days, whispers began to circulate through the underworld, and even among the police themselves, that Monaghan and Lyons were not being treated like regular prisoners. Something far more complex and far more secretive was unfolding behind the scenes. Inside the walls of what authorities called a high-security isolation unit, Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. were living under conditions that few could have imagined for two of Scotland's most feared criminal figures. Rumors began to swirl, almost immediately, among those within the justice system. Guards who had been transferred to the new facility whispered about unusual orders, no direct communication with the inmates, limited access for regular staff, and strange deliveries arriving in unmarked vans. It became clear that this was no ordinary prison experience. The private wing where Monaghan and Lyons were held had been constructed months earlier under the pretext of improving conditions for high-risk inmates. Yet, everything about it seemed designed not for punishment, but for protection. The walls were freshly painted, the floors polished, and unlike the rest of the aging facility, this area had modern furniture, climate control, and even a fitness suite reserved for its 2 occupants. It was soon nicknamed the VIP prison by a handful of insiders who knew the truth. Meals were delivered by a private catering company, instead of standard prison kitchens. Both men had access to high-quality food, reading materials, and limited television privileges far beyond what the average inmate could expect. Security cameras monitored every angle, but only a select group of supervisors had clearance to review the footage. This secrecy made it nearly impossible for anyone outside the chain of command to know what was truly happening inside those walls. Official reports described the arrangement as a measure to ensure inmate safety. Authorities argued that Monaghan and Lyons were high-profile figures with multiple enemies both inside and outside the prison system. Isolating them, officials claimed, was the only way to prevent retaliation or assassination attempts. To the public, this explanation sounded reasonable, but for those familiar with the realities of Scotland's gangland wars, it seemed too convenient. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder that the 2 men were cooperating with select elements of law enforcement. Some officers believed Monaghan and Lyons had offered inside information about rival groups, drug routes, and corruption networks in exchange for comfortable treatment. If true, it meant that 2 of Glasgow's most dangerous men had struck a secret deal that allowed them to maintain power while pretending to be neutralized. Inside the prison, the special treatment created resentment among staff. Guards assigned to the VIP wing reported being kept in the dark, forced to follow instructions without question. They were told not to speak to the inmates unless absolutely necessary, not to ask questions, and never to discuss their shifts outside the facility. The higher-ups justified everything under the label of national security. Still, something about the setup felt wrong to those on the inside. Meanwhile, outside the walls, crime had not stopped. Shootings, drug shipments, and threats continued across Glasgow, and investigators were baffled at how operations so tightly linked to Monaghan's and Lyons's network seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed. It was as though their imprisonment had been carefully staged, a show for the public, while behind the scenes business remained uninterrupted. For many, the so-called VIP prison began to look less like a place of confinement and more like a fortress built to protect the very men it was meant to punish. As weeks turned into months, the mystery surrounding the secretive detention of Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. deepened. What began as a supposed security measure started to resemble something far more intricate, a network of power that extended beyond the walls of the prison and into the very heart of Scotland's justice system. The arrangement seemed too polished, too protected, and too carefully managed to be merely about inmate safety. Investigators who had once celebrated the arrests now found themselves quietly questioning what had really been achieved. Evidence began to surface suggesting that the VIP prison was more than a holding area. It was part of a covert operation involving senior law enforcement, private contractors, and political figures. Confidential documents hinted at agreements between prison authorities and private companies that had ties to offshore accounts. One of these companies, operating under the name Highfield Solutions, had been awarded an undisclosed contract to oversee special security management. The trail of paperwork led investigators through a maze of corporate shell structures, ending abruptly in jurisdictions known for secrecy and tax evasion. Someone powerful wanted to keep the full truth hidden. Within the prison, Monaghan and Lyons seemed to live under a different set of rules entirely. Despite being under supposed isolation, they managed to receive information from the outside world with remarkable ease. Prison intelligence reports noted subtle but suspicious patterns: delivery vans arriving late at night, new electronics installed under maintenance orders, and staff changes that coincided with gangland events happening on the streets of Glasgow. It appeared as though the men were not only being protected, but actively kept informed. Law enforcement sources began to suspect that both Monaghan and Lyons were acting as intermediaries between rival criminal factions, using their privileged access to broker peace or stir chaos when it benefited them. Their influence seemed to stretch far beyond the confines of their cells. What shocked investigators most was the growing evidence that elements within the government were complicit, believing that allowing these men to maintain a degree of control from behind bars would stabilize ongoing gang wars. To them it was better to keep the underworld's power brokers contained and cooperative rather than unleashed on the streets. But not everyone within the system agreed with this hidden alliance. A small circle of detectives began to quietly gather evidence, convinced that the so-called arrangement was undermining justice itself. One of them leaked fragments of classified memos, suggesting that the intelligence shared by Monaghan and Lyons was minimal, outdated, and largely self-serving. They were not dismantling their empire. They were expanding it, using their position inside the VIP prison as cover to coordinate operations with less suspicion. Meanwhile, whispers circulated through Glasgow's criminal circles that the two men were untouchable. Rival gangs that had once plotted against them suddenly backed off, fearful of unseen forces protecting their enemies. It was as though Monaghan and Lyons had traded prison bars for a different kind of freedom, a hidden seat of power, where they could operate under the guise of incarceration. Behind every layer of control and secrecy, a question lingered: who was truly running Scotland's criminal underworld? The gangsters or those sworn to stop them? The illusion of control began to unravel when a string of violent attacks erupted across the west of Scotland. Despite Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. being supposedly locked away under maximum surveillance, the shootings bore the same hallmarks that detectives had come to associate with their criminal network: precision, timing, and absolute silence afterward. Victims were not random targets, but individuals with deep ties to ongoing gang feuds. Some were low-level enforcers, others mid-ranking dealers, and a few were known police informants. The message behind each killing was unmistakable: power was still in the hands of those who claimed to have lost it. For investigators, it was both infuriating and frightening. The VIP prison was meant to neutralize two of the most dangerous men in Scotland, yet the violence outside suggested that they were still orchestrating every move. The theory that Monaghan and Lyons were running their operations from within the prison walls gained strength when encrypted messages intercepted by cyber units were traced back to devices linked to the facility's internal network. Someone on the inside was helping them communicate with the outside world. It was no longer a matter of speculation. The technology used was sophisticated, far beyond what ordinary inmates could access. Authorities discovered hidden SIM cards embedded within radio devices used by maintenance crews, and coded notes slipped through food delivery containers. Each time one line of communication was cut, another emerged. The network had been built with precision, almost as if the prison itself was part of the plan from the beginning. Those investigating began to wonder if Monaghan and Lyons had known exactly what they were walking into when they were arrested, that the prison wasn't a trap but a fortress designed for them. Inside the facility, their behavior remained calm and disciplined. Neither man made any attempt to challenge guards, demand privileges, or cause trouble. They appeared content, even confident, as though they knew something others did not. Surveillance footage showed them reading newspapers and working out daily, never showing concern over the growing chaos outside. It was this eerie composure that unsettled investigators the most. They were supposed to be powerless, yet everything about their demeanor suggested control. Meanwhile, the attacks escalated. Cars were set ablaze, businesses linked to rival gangs were bombed, and a police convoy was ambushed in what authorities later described as a military-style operation. Each event carried the same signature, carefully executed with no traceable evidence. Intelligence analysts began to piece together the timeline and discovered an uncanny pattern. Every attack coincided with special visits or deliveries to the VIP wing. What was meant to be an isolated facility had become the nerve center of ongoing violence. When the press got wind of the situation, officials scrambled to suppress the story. Publicly, police insisted that the recent violence was the work of splinter groups, denying any connection to the imprisoned men. Privately, however, panic spread within the ranks. If Monaghan and Lyons could maintain this level of control while confined, it meant that Scotland's justice system had been compromised beyond repair. The idea that criminals could operate freely under government protection was no longer just a theory, it was reality. And as the body count rose, the truth was becoming impossible to hide. The first sign that the truth was beginning to slip through the cracks came from within the prison itself. A correctional officer, whose name was never made public, began quietly documenting the irregularities he witnessed inside the so-called VIP wing. He had joined the staff only months before, unaware that his new post would expose him to one of the most secretive and controversial operations in Scotland's penal history. At first, he noticed small inconsistencies, deliveries arriving without signatures, maintenance teams that seemed to answer to no one, and orders that came directly from higher authorities rather than through the usual chain of command. But as time went on, what he discovered would shake the foundations of the justice system. The officer's reports described a lifestyle that resembled a private retreat rather than a maximum security cell block. Monaghan and Lyons had personal quarters with soft furnishings, expensive toiletries, and an entertainment system that should never have been allowed inside any correctional facility. They received daily meals from a luxury catering company, complete with imported meats and bottled mineral water. Guards were instructed to refer to them as high-value detainees, and interaction was restricted to a handful of senior officers with special clearance. Even prison governors were required to schedule appointments before entering their area. Unable to ignore what he was seeing, the officer began secretly photographing the unusual conditions. He captured images of the lavish rooms, the private gym, and the late-night deliveries that arrived in unmarked vans. With the help of an investigative journalist, he leaked the material to a local newspaper. The exposé was published under the headline, "Gang Lords Living in Luxury Behind Bars." The photographs spread across social media within hours, sparking outrage across the country. Citizens demanded to know how two of Scotland's most dangerous men were enjoying such comfort while taxpayers footed the bill. Under mounting pressure, the government announced a full investigation into the VIP prison scandal. Lawmakers promised transparency, and reporters camped outside the facility demanding answers. But before any inquiry could begin, tragedy struck. The whistleblower, the officer who had leaked the story, vanished. He failed to show up for work one morning, and calls to his phone went unanswered. 2 days later, his car was found abandoned near Loch Lomond. Inside were his personal belongings and ID, but there was no sign of him. Authorities publicly labeled it a case of voluntary disappearance, suggesting that the man might have fled due to fear of retaliation. Yet colleagues and journalists who knew him were convinced otherwise. They believed he had been silenced. Within the prison, panic spread among staff. Those who had previously complained about strange procedures suddenly stopped speaking. Internal memos were issued warning employees not to discuss the VIP unit with outsiders, citing national security. The inquiry that had been promised quietly lost momentum. Key witnesses withdrew, documents went missing, and the media attention was redirected to other scandals. But beneath the silence, suspicion continued to grow. People began to question whether the whistleblower's disappearance was an accident, or the latest casualty in a chain of events orchestrated to keep Monaghan and Lyons untouchable. The leak had momentarily exposed their secret world, but it had also proven something far more chilling. Anyone who tried to challenge that world risked disappearing without a trace. In the aftermath of the whistleblower's disappearance, the illusion of order inside Scotland's justice system began to fracture. Behind closed doors, an internal investigation attempted to piece together how two of the country's most dangerous criminals had come to live like royalty in a supposedly high-security environment. What investigators uncovered revealed a web of corruption so deep that it blurred the line between the authorities and the very criminals they claimed to be fighting. Every thread pulled exposed another connection: politicians, private contractors, and law enforcement officials, all tied directly or indirectly to the secretive network protecting Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. Financial records became the key to unlocking the mystery. A paper trail led to a series of offshore bank accounts, based in Cyprus, Malta, and the Isle of Man. Funds from these accounts had been funneled through legitimate prison contracts, under names that sounded ordinary: maintenance services, catering suppliers and technology providers. But hidden behind the paperwork was a company registered under a different name each time. Highfield Solutions, Northmark Consulting, and later Horizon Security Systems. All were traced back to the same directors, all connected to associates of Monaghan's old network. The discovery confirmed that the so-called VIP prison was not just a secure facility, it was a privately financed safehouse, built with the assistance of those who profited from organized crime. Investigators were stunned to learn that parts of the facility's funding came from donations made through shell charities that claimed to support prisoner rehabilitation. The irony was inescapable. The money used to build a rehabilitation wing had been sourced from the very criminal empire it was meant to dismantle. When questioned, senior officials deflected, insisting the funds had passed all necessary audits. Yet, the signatures on several authorization forms belonged to people who no longer worked for the government or had died years earlier. Someone had rewritten history to protect their creation. The revelations ignited fierce debate within the justice system. A handful of honest officers tried to expose the truth, but they were quickly silenced through demotions, forced retirements, or sudden transfers. Files disappeared overnight. Surveillance footage of key meetings between prison administrators and outside contractors was accidentally erased. It became increasingly clear that the corruption was not confined to one facility, it was systemic, stretching into the highest levels of authority. Meanwhile, Monaghan and Lyons continued to live comfortably, untouched by the chaos swirling outside their prison wing. To those within their network, they were legends, symbols of untouchable power. Rumors circulated that they still had direct lines of communication with top figures in Scotland's underworld and even beyond, influencing drug shipments, money laundering operations, and contract killings from behind bars. By late 2024, the phrase VIP prison had taken on a darker meaning. It wasn't simply a place of privilege, it was a monument to corruption. A reminder that justice could be bought, controlled, and silenced. The investigation into the facility eventually lost momentum under political pressure, replaced by vague promises of structural reform. But to those who had seen what really went on, one truth was undeniable: the system itself had become a tool of the criminals it was built to contain. The scandal reached its peak in the summer of 2024, when news broke that Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. had vanished without a trace. The revelation came during a routine head count one early morning. Their cells were found empty, beds perfectly made, belongings neatly arranged, and no signs of struggle or forced escape. Security cameras showed them inside their cells the previous night, but by dawn both men had disappeared as if they had never existed. The prison went into immediate lockdown. Helicopters circled the compound. Roadblocks were set up for miles, and armed response units were deployed across the region. Yet despite the massive operation, no evidence of their departure was found. It was as though the walls had simply opened and swallowed them whole. When investigators reviewed the surveillance footage, they discovered a chilling anomaly. Between 2:00 and 3:00 a.m., every camera in the VIP wing went offline for exactly 47 minutes. The official explanation cited a technical fault, but engineers later confirmed that the system had been manually disabled from an internal control room, accessible only to senior staff. Whoever orchestrated the escape had full knowledge of the prison's layout, timing, and procedure. It was an inside job, carried out with military precision. As the investigation widened, new information surfaced, pointing to a private security firm contracted to manage external transport and logistics for the facility. Records showed that, on the night of the escape, an unmarked van with falsified credentials entered the compound under authorization from the same offshore company previously linked to Monaghan's associates. That van, according to satellite tracking data, left the prison grounds at 3, heading north before disappearing from all systems near the Scottish Highlands. The discovery sent shockwaves through government offices. Questions were raised in Parliament about how two high-profile inmates under constant surveillance could vanish so completely. Officials scrambled to produce statements, each more evasive than the last. The public, already disillusioned by months of corruption scandals, demanded answers. But before any official report could be released, an anonymous tip reached investigators in France. A helicopter matching the description of one registered to the Cyprus Front Company had landed in a remote airfield outside Marseille less than 12 hours after the disappearance. Witnesses reported seeing two men offload from the aircraft before it lifted off again toward the Mediterranean coast. The men matched the descriptions of Monaghan and Lyons. Interpol quickly joined the hunt, but no trace of the fugitives was found. Bank accounts associated with their network had been emptied in the days leading up to the escape, suggesting a meticulously planned exit strategy. Investigators believed the pair had fled under new identities, supported by a network of powerful allies who owed them loyalty and protection. Inside Scotland, the fallout was catastrophic. Senior officials resigned, several guards were arrested, and the prison's governor was found dead in his home, an apparent suicide. Yet many suspected he had been silenced to protect others. What had started as a symbol of security had turned into a monument of betrayal. The escape of Monaghan and Lyons exposed the full rot within the system, proof that Scotland's most feared criminals had not been captured at all, merely sheltered until the time came for them to walk free. Months passed after the shocking disappearance of Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr., yet Scotland remained haunted by their shadows. Despite international alerts and ongoing investigations, neither man was ever found. Interpol, Europol, and local authorities worked together, tracing dozens of false leads stretching across Europe. Each clue led nowhere. The fugitives had vanished into a network of forged identities, offshore accounts, and safe houses spread across multiple countries. Their escape had not been a desperate act. It had been the final stage of a carefully orchestrated plan that exposed the deep corruption running through the system, meant to contain them. As investigators followed the money trail, they discovered that in the weeks before the escape, millions of pounds had been quietly transferred from shell companies connected to the prison contracts into accounts in Luxembourg and Monaco. From there, the funds were split into smaller deposits under anonymous trusts. It became clear that Monaghan and Lyons had used their supposed incarceration not only to avoid danger but to rebuild and relocate their criminal empire. Rumors soon surfaced of a new organization emerging on the continent, a syndicate known only as the Network. Intelligence sources believed it was led by the same men once thought to be Scotland's most notorious inmates. In Glasgow, the consequences of their escape lingered like a scar. The justice system, once confident in its authority, now faced a crisis of legitimacy. A government inquiry promised accountability, but the results were predictable. Vague conclusions, sealed documents, and a quiet reassignment of those involved. The public outcry slowly faded, replaced by fatigue and resignation. Newspapers that had once run daily headlines about the scandal shifted focus to new stories, while officials worked to bury the embarrassment. Yet behind the scenes, some officers continued to investigate, refusing to accept that the trail had gone cold. One such officer, a detective who had worked on the original arrests, uncovered evidence suggesting that Monaghan and Lyons had not fled entirely abroad. There were reports of private estates in the Scottish Highlands being purchased through intermediaries, properties isolated enough to hide anyone who wanted to disappear. Drones captured images of unfamiliar vehicles arriving late at night, and shipments of supplies being delivered under heavy security. But before a raid could be organized, the operation was mysteriously cancelled. The order came from higher authorities, the same excuse that had been used throughout the VIP prison scandal. The detective was soon transferred out of the unit and told to drop the matter. Outside of official circles, the legend of the two men grew. In pubs, alleyways, and the corners of Glasgow's Underworld, whispers spread that Monaghan and Lyons had become untouchable ghosts, living symbols of how power and corruption could twist justice into protection. Some claimed they were living in luxury somewhere along the French Riviera, guarded by mercenaries and connected to European drug cartels. Others believed they had faked their escape entirely and were still in Scotland, hidden by the same network that built the VIP prison in the first place. Years later, when the government quietly shut down the facility, the cells once occupied by the two men were left untouched. Beds neatly made, walls spotless, as if waiting for their return. No one dared to officially reopen the case. It became one of Scotland's great unsolved mysteries, a reminder of how easily truth could be buried under layers of power and deceit. For the public, the story faded into rumor, but for those who had seen the evidence firsthand, there was no doubt Ross Monaghan and Eddie Lyons Jr. hadn't escaped justice. They had mastered it.